On the afternoon of May 15, 2017, a Learjet 35A, tail number November 452 Delta Alpha, lifted off from Philadelphia International Airport bound for Teterboro, New Jersey. It was supposed to be nothing more than a routine repositioning flight. No passengers, no cargo, just two pilots ferrying the aircraft to its next assignment. The flight was short, the weather was clear, and there was nothing unusual about the mission. Yet, within 28 minutes, the jet was gone, crashing violently into an industrial area just 1 kilometer from the runway. Something between the two pilots went terribly wrong in that cockpit. What could happen in such a short span of time? Let's find out in this episode. The Learjet 35A, a sleek twin-engine business jet known for its speed and range, was operated by Trans-Pacific Air Charter, LLC, and registered to ANC Big Sky Aviation, LLC. It was a workhorse in the charter industry, often flying executives and VIP to their destinations. But today, it wasn't carrying anyone important, just two pilots rushing through their third flight of the day. Sitting in the left seat was the 53-year-old captain, an experienced aviator with 6,900 total flight hours. Despite his experience, there were whispers among colleagues that he wasn't as sharp as he should have been. He had struggled with certain flight maneuvers in training, including the very type of circling approach that would later lead to the crash. Next to him was the 33-year-old first officer, or SIC, significantly less experienced, with 1,170 total hours. By company policy, he was not supposed to be flying. His job was to assist and monitor, not to take the controls. But for reasons that would soon prove disastrous, the captain had let him fly the approach into Teterboro anyway. This was the crew's third flight of the day, following two earlier trips transporting passengers. While repositioning flights are a routine part of the charter industry, they still require strict adherence to procedures and effective crew coordination. However, the informal nature of this flight may have contributed to a lax approach to safety and procedural compliance. The aircraft took off at approximately 3:04 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. As it left Philadelphia, it climbed as planned to 4,000 feet and was then given a direct route to the Mazy waypoint. However, ATC issued vectors for sequencing, briefly diverting them from their planned course. The pilots expressed frustration over their altitude and heading assignments, and during this phase they exceeded the airspeed limitation of 250 knots below 10,000 feet, one of multiple airspeed violations throughout the flight. About 10 minutes into the flight, the crew checked in with New York approach. The controller assigned them an ILS approach to runway 6 at Teterboro, instructing them to circle to land on runway 1. This maneuver was standard for arrivals from the west when strong northwesterly winds were present. However, the captain seemed confused about their location and expressed annoyance at the approach instructions. At that point, they were just 48 nautical miles from Teterboro, but the captain mistakenly believed they were much farther away. Shortly after, ATC instructed the crew to descend to 3,000 feet. The pilots tuned into the ATIS frequency for weather updates, but the captain did not listen to the entire transmission. As they intercepted the localizer for runway 6, the first officer misidentified Newark International Airport as Teterboro and mistakenly told the captain that he had the runway in sight. The Learjet flew through the localizer course, prompting a controller correction. The crew adjusted their course and turned left to get back on track, eventually proceeding toward the waypoint Vings. During this time, the first officer attempted to hand over control of the aircraft to the captain, but the captain declined, allowing him to continue flying the approach. 8 miles from Vings, the approach controller cleared them for the approach. At this point, the pilots should have conducted an approach briefing, but they failed to do so. Instead, the captain continued coaching the first officer through altitude and speed requirements. ATC then instructed them to cross the waypoint Dandy at 1,500 feet and begin circling at Torby, which was the final approach fix. However, the crew neglected to follow all these instructions. They did not contact the tower, crossed Dandy at 2,000 feet instead of 1,500, and failed to start their circling maneuver at Tharby. 2 minutes later, the approach controller again reminded them to contact the tower, but the captain remained focused on coaching the first officer rather than completing necessary procedures. The tower finally established communication and cleared the Learjet to land on runway 1. The aircraft, still not aligned with the runway, was now 1 nautical mile from the approach end of runway 6. The tower controller noticed the situation and asked, "Delta Alpha, you going to start that turn?" The pilots responded that they were initiating the turn. At this moment, the first officer began a sharp right turn. A tower controller later recalled seeing the Learjet's belly, indicating that the aircraft was nearly perpendicular to the ground. Midway through the turn, the first officer, now audibly stressed, relinquished control to the captain. The captain took over and attempted a steep left turn to align with runway 1. The first officer repeatedly called out airspeed, but the captain did not immediately react. Then the captain called out stall, and the first officer echoed the warning. Security cameras from nearby buildings captured the final moments of the flight. The Learjet was seen in a dangerously steep nose-down attitude. One video showed the aircraft in a right bank of approximately 125 degrees just before impact. At 3:30 p.m., the Learjet crashed in an industrial area less than a mile south of Teterboro Airport. Both pilots were killed instantly. There were no passengers on board, and miraculously, no one on the ground was harmed despite the crash occurring in a populated area. The wreckage was extensively damaged, with debris scattered across the site. The outcome was devastating, marking a tragic end to what should have been a routine flight. After an extensive investigation, the NTSB determined that the probable cause of the accident was the pilot in command's decision to continue an unstabilized approach, ultimately leading to an aerodynamic stall at low altitude. Despite multiple warning signs that the approach was not properly executed, the captain persisted, attempting to force the aircraft into a landing rather than executing a go-around. A key factor in the loss of control was the captain's fixation on visually aligning with the runway, which distracted him from monitoring critical flight parameters. As the aircraft banked sharply, the crew received multiple indications of decreasing airspeed and an impending stall, yet the captain failed to respond appropriately. The first officer repeatedly called out airspeed, a clear warning that the aircraft was dangerously close to stalling. However, the captain's delayed reaction and his ultimate failure to take corrective action in time resulted in the fatal stall just seconds before impact. But when viewed from a wider perspective, this crash reveals a deeply unsettling pattern of systemic failures, disregarded policies, and a cockpit plagued by dysfunction. It wasn't the result of a single misstep, but rather the inevitable consequence of a culture that normalized rule-breaking, overlooked inadequate training, and operated under dangerously weak oversight. Long before the Learjet made its final turn, the conditions for disaster had already been set in motion. The very first issue was the captain's reckless decision to allow the first officer to fly the approach, a move that directly violated company policy. The first officer had a documented history of performance issues, yet the captain handed him the controls anyway. The result, a cockpit environment where the PIC spent more time micromanaging than actually monitoring the flight. Instead of overseeing the big picture, he was correcting basic flying errors that had no place in a critical phase of flight. As the aircraft neared Teterboro, the first officer's inexperience and uncertainty became painfully clear, adding unnecessary stress and confusion in a high workload, congested airspace. Had the captain simply followed the rules and taken control himself, the approach might have been salvageable. But he didn't. The lack of pre-flight planning and an approach briefing only made things worse. In any professional flight deck, pilots are expected to mentally rehearse the approach before starting descent, anticipating challenges, setting clear expectations, and ensuring both crew members are on the same page. But in this case, the pilots skipped this crucial step. As a result, when they were assigned the circling maneuver, they were unprepared, uncoordinated, and unaware of the specific altitude and navigation requirements. They missed key waypoints, failed to contact the tower on time, and ultimately mismanaged the circling maneuver altogether. It was a textbook example of how complacency and poor planning can create confusion at the worst possible time. If the cockpit was disorganized, it was nothing compared to the complete failure of crew resource management, CRM. CRM is supposed to prevent situations exactly like this, where one pilot is overloaded while the other is ineffective. But in this flight, the roles were completely reversed. The captain, who should have been in command, was too busy coaching, while the first officer, who should not have been flying at all, was fumbling his way through a difficult approach. The captain failed to intervene when the first officer mistook Newark Airport for Teterboro, he failed to ensure a proper descent, and most critically, he failed to react to the repeated airspeed callouts that preceded the stall. The first officer, meanwhile, lacked both the skill and the authority to take corrective action, further straining the already fragile cockpit coordination. By the time either of them realized how far off course they were, there was no time left to recover. But this wasn't just a failure in the cockpit, it was a failure of the entire system that put these two pilots in the air together in the first place. The charter company's lack of enforcement when it came to safety policies made it clear that rule-breaking was tolerated, if not outright encouraged. The fact that the first officer was even allowed to take control of the aircraft suggests a culture where pilots were accustomed to bending the rules without consequence. Even more concerning was the captain's known history of training struggles, particularly with circling approaches, the exact maneuver that led to this crash. Management either ignored or failed to act on these warning signs, letting him fly as PIC despite clear evidence that he wasn't ready for the responsibility. And where was the FAA in all of this? The agency that is supposed to hold operators accountable for safety standards failed to catch the glaring procedural violations that were happening right under its nose. A more thorough oversight process could have flagged the captain's training deficiencies, the first officer's questionable qualifications, and the company's relaxed approach to pilot assignments, any one of which could have prevented these two from being paired together in such a high-risk scenario. Instead, the cracks in the system were ignored until they widened into catastrophe. In the end, this accident wasn't just avoidable, it was predictable. The disregard for regulations, the absence of planning, the lack of discipline in the cockpit, and the failure of oversight all but ensured that something would go wrong. And when it did, there was no margin left for error. This wasn't just pilot error, it was a failure at every level of the operation, and the cost was 2 lives and a completely preventable tragedy.